Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the panel on curating inclusion in the context of the November New Music Conference. And I'm Christos Karas. I'm the Executive Director of the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens, and I will be loosely coordinating this discussion and presentation around the themes of inclusion and diversity that are at the center of the Sounds Now project. Sounds Now is a network co-funded by the European Union Creative Europe program, and its whole reason for existing is to reflect and act on the issues of gatekeeping and control and power and diversity and inclusion in the new music world. So that's what we both try and understand about the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms, but also our own mental mechanisms in the process of designing programs, of presenting, but also thinking about what we can do after we've tried to understand what the situation is to make this situation better and move towards what we try and understand as a goal of greater diversity and inclusion. The title of this panel is Curating Inclusion, and of course that is a good place to start because it's a fairly complex title in two words. It's on the one hand, of course, if we take curating in its etymological acceptance of taking care of, then curating inclusion means taking care of, being aware of and looking after the issue of inclusion in our work. On the other hand, if we take curating in the sense of the practice of what we normally do in our professional work, which is organizing programs, selecting, excluding, then of course curating inclusion is quite a contradictory title because it already underlines the question that I think we'll be discussing a lot about how do you actually purposefully work on a theme like inclusion when being able to do it already implies a certain position of power and gatekeeping in this process. So it's an interesting title. So we'll start with a brief round of introductions by my co-speakers. We'll show some examples of projects that people have been working on, have a little discussion here with some, let's say, some central questions, and then open up the floor to questions from you. So, a quick round of introductions. Raquel.
Hello. My name is Raquel Castro. I come from Lisbon, Portugal, and I direct a festival in Lisbon called Lisboa Soa, which is a sound art festival that I will briefly show some images somewhere in this conversation. It's a festival that occupies public spaces in the city with sound art. And currently I'm working with Sounds Now under the project Sound Art in Public Spaces, which is a sound art exhibition taking place in 5 different cities and festivals. And you can see one of them here at November Music, and the first one at Will the Western, which is closing this weekend. And that's it for now.
Monica.
Hi, hello everyone. It's wonderful to be here. And my name is Monica Żyła, and I'm a musicologist, author, researcher, and I'm responsible for the research part in the Sounds Now project. So that's me.
Maud, Maud.
Maud, yeah, it's okay. Doesn't matter. I'm Maud Suntjes. I'm a curator and researcher also in sound. And I worked before at Bruxelles Nous Appartient, Brussels behoort ons toe, which is an organization that works about the auditive memory of Brussels. And then afterwards I worked as an artistic coordinator at Musica, Impulse Center for Music, in Belgium, where I coordinated like the curating lab for Sounds Now, but I also curated and leaded the Oortreders Festival, which is also a sound art festival in public spaces. And now I'm working as a researcher and programmer for Sonic Acts, also on sound art and the public space.
Well, it's great because we have a very wide range of expertise and experience and practice here. So I suggest we start by putting some examples out there for people to see that we can then base our discussion on. And so if I haven't sort of messed this up completely, I think, Maud, we're starting with you.
Yes.
So, okay.
Yes, exactly. I will keep it short, as we said. But when working for Musica, I was also the curator and the artistic coordinator of Klankenbos, which is a sound art space in the northeast of Belgium, in a forest with 18 sound artworks. And as I was working already a lot about sound and participation, sound public space, site-specific creation, I was really wondering, the forest contained out of 18 installations at that moment, but I was wondering, there were monumentals standing there. How can you open up this space even more to the local inhabitants or different groups in the area, and how can you make them feel more at home also or related to the collection? And first of all, I started talking with many organizations in the area, which one of them was the local refugee shelter. And they were really interested to collaborate on a project. And at that moment, we also had the Oortreders Festival. That's something I also want to add, because I also wanted to make this paradox between what is curating, and if you talk about inclusion, how do you really curate inclusion, as curating is also selecting but for me, at least, it is always to create a context that is as open as possible. And I see my role as a curator often like this, that it's more how to make things as inclusive as possible. And for me, it's always a layered process. It's not with one project that you will suddenly have an inclusive impact or an inclusive audience or relationships with artists. Or it's really, for me, a process that's on all layers of the organization, of the festival, of the program, of the relationships you build, the co-creative maybe trajectories also you give place in the experimental side also of it. So it happens also outside what we can even imagine. So voila. I'm cut off. No. But I started with Klankenbos, and so the sound forest, and the idea of making it, open it up, the refugee shelter, and then I was also in conversation with the artist Felix Bloem, which is a French sound artist working all around the world, based in Mexico and Brazil, and we brought them together actually, and he came up with the idea to create a collection of doors in the middle of the forest, which tell the stories and the voices and the sounds of the people living in the refugee shelter. So maybe there's a small video, maybe we can watch it.
بالعيا كل يوم أنا أصحى الصبح الساعة 5:30 أو 6.
Ishikumakunu dilolokumaku wawe undenge wangu
كوباية سميد كوباية طحين معلقتين ينسون ناعم معلقة
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Cause no pain, no study. No studies, you fail.
No envidio el vuelo ni el nido al turpial. Soy como el viento en la miel.
6 en 5 minuten. Ik moet
What you see is a permanent sound art installation in the middle of the forest. It's 12 doors, and the doors come from people living in the village. It's old outside doors we collected with an open call, and we placed them in the forest, and each door tells a story of one person or family, or but not really the story told as a story, but it's more fragments of their living, and fragments they really would like to express themselves. So the artists really lived for a while, like a month, with the refugees, spending a lot of time with them to, in the end, have this collection of fragments of life stories. What happened, it's not only an artwork, but there's also a whole process that happened, a social process, in which little by little, also a relationship was built between the place and the inhabitants of the refugee shelter. So what we see now is that at the activities and the projects we organized afterwards, there was always people from the shelter that came, for example, to the forest, or when they go on a visit with school, with their class, the children really present the installation to their classmates, or they really feel like it's their installation. And they have a place, their voices, stories. It's also this polyphony of the voices has a place in the village. So they have a point of reference, which is crucial when you are living on the go in a shelter without any perspective. What's the case for almost all of them. This is the example. Very shortly afterwards, we also made a book with them. So the whole process was also took the shape of a book, in which we together also reflected on what it actually meant to take part in this project. Voilà.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we'll come back to several themes you mentioned, especially the way this whole process has to go through the various layers of the organization. It's not enough just to think in terms of the artwork. We'll come back to that later. Raquel, I think you're next with an example from
yes.
Lisboa.
So I would suggest maybe we could stream the video with the sound really low. We really don't need to listen it very loud. And I will just briefly explain a little bit the story about this festival. Because it came out naturally throughout a path where I started to research on sound and listening mainly. After visiting conferences and sound-related events, I started to think a lot about how do you really show sound and sound art related projects. And also, because the connection with the space is so important, the proposal was to go into the streets and use the public space as a kind of arena for artistic expression. I would, if you can just stream it, and because it's, I prepared this really short video with a few examples about that I feel has to do a lot with inclusion. I think we all know that sound is somehow sometimes a bit too hermetic, and many sound experimental music and sound art events may be a little bit far away from general audience. In this case, in the case of Lisboa Soa, as it was integrated in the festivities of the city, and it's happening outside in the public space, and it's free entrance, everything. So it's a 4-day festival with workshops, sound walks, performances, and sound installations. So it's like, for me, inclusion has to do with this. When you bring the audience to experiment, to really try out, and to feel included, by interacting not only with the pieces but also with the artists in many different ways. So you can just put the video and a little bit slower. So basically, we try to keep participatory projects as a real important and crucial aspect. I feel that inclusion has to do a lot with education. And so this is the kind of the spirit of the festival, and you have an audience made up with kids from elderly people, and it's a very experiential
Sound has a special relationship
kind
to
of
emotion, instinct, and memory, both individual and collective.
And as you understand easily, when it comes to sound and listening, it has all to do with human experience. So I think it's, in my opinion, one way to be inclusive and, you know, just put the technology accessible and bring people in, and it will come out naturally. That's the idea. In this case, for example, there was a one-week workshop building out these sound backpacks, and then the participants made the performance. There are a lot of, I think the festival is quite well documented, and on YouTube easily you will find. In this case, for example, we use the water reservoirs. We also try to maintain this kind of playfulness. For example, in this case, there were these devices built up by Lucas Kuhn, and anyone could just hold them and hear through them around. It's not like something you cannot touch, like in a museum or something. So, I mean, that's the idea. I think it's okay, we can go to Monica. And then there's also but I think, I don't know if it's in this round, which the other example I would like to show, but it's on or maybe you can show it now, maybe, because if you can just show the other link, which has to do with the sound art in public spaces. And basically it explains itself. It's like me talking, so I don't need to keep talking. And it was made by the team, documentation team from the festival. And I come from Lisbon, Portugal. I'm a sound researcher and curator and also film director. And I've been dedicating my work to understanding the role of sound in our lives and in our spaces. And I've been doing a lot of sound art installations in public spaces, always trying to bring the audience to this public space and experience it through sound and through sound artworks. Here in Kortrijk, we are in this huge 5,000 square meters pavilion. When I came here a few months ago, this is an empty pavilion. It's an old industrial site. I thought that in such a place without any kind of natural life would be interesting to recreate somehow a natural ecosystem inside. When you think of a sound exhibition, you have to understand that, you know, the walls don't block sound, so works can be contaminated. So the idea here is that all works can coexist. Each works represents different ecosystems. That's why you will have water sounds, you will have non-human sounds, you will have winds, and you will have geological sounds from a tree. It's a kind of exhibition that you could come with your eyes closed, but in this case all of the pieces are also very visual, so the mechanism, the devices behind, it's also interesting to observe. One of the things that it's at the core of this Sounds Now project, which is also something that I try to practice in my work, which is this idea of inclusion. So when it comes to the arts, I think inclusion is when you bring a seed to the place. If you bring someone that will work in the place, with the place, and with the local community, project is to be able to work with different spaces, and when it comes to sound art, it really has to start there in the space you occupy. And this exhibition is completely different from the ones that you can see here, which are spread around. And for example, in the case of Sonoscopia, they are here present and doing this water related series of installations for the project, which are all completely adapted to each location, and I think this is the most challenging and interesting idea behind. Anyway.
The Sonoscopia installation is in the building opposite the Fekade Fabrik, so please go and have a look. It's really very beautiful.
And there's a performance tomorrow at 7:30 p.m.
Perhaps. Anyway,
no, for sure.
Is, okay, good. Just as well. All right. Well, Monica, over to you.
Thank you. I brought an example of a production that actually belongs to the Sounds Now project that was developed within that framework. And it's called Eupepsia Dyspepsia, and it was composed by and conceived by Eva Reiter and Professor of Cultural Studies Karin Harasser, and the format of this production is actually a lecture performance. And I was thinking about how this production actually deals with inclusion and diversity, and I think it's because it's really invested in decanonization of contemporary music repertoire, because let me tell you what it is. So the production is actually, it's a commentary on an archiving and an archive, and it deals with like colonial story of it's a Bolivian music juxtaposed with contemporary Western music and Western music from 18th century, so the Baroque period, and so it's a format of like a concert, but it's also narrated, and it tells the story of how the Christian missionaries arrived in Bolivia and how they used music to colonize the indigenous nations living there. And so it's kind of like a commentary of colonial past of music, and it's also really interesting because Eva Reiter herself is as a specialist. She's a composer, she's a performer, so she writes contemporary music, and her compositions are, of course, contemporary. But she also has education in 18th century Baroque performance, and she plays viola, so that kind of naturally comes from her practice. And so if we could have a quick look at some video, you will get an idea what I'm talking about.
Eupepsia. Das ist die gute Verdauung. Die Pepsi-Cola hat ihren Namen von ihr. Aber Pepsi ist weltweit sehr viel weniger erfolgreich als Coca-Cola, das man noch im letzten Winkel dieser Erde bekommt. Was haben eigentlich die Indigenen in den todbringenden Europäern gesehen? Sodass sie zumindest mancherorts, denn sehr häufig wurden die Missionare ja auch umgebracht, bereitwillig und rasch den Glauben annahmen. Es gibt sicherlich auch spirituelle Gründe dafür. Denn der Feind ist in den amazonischen Kosmologien als der radikal andere aufgefasst. Aber die individuelle Inkorporierung des Feindes durch den Mörder dokumentiert Viveiros de Castro für die Aravete wie folgt. Nachdem er einen Feind getötet oder einfach nur verwundet hat, stirbt der Krieger. Sobald er in das Dorf zurückgekehrt ist, verfällt er in eine Art Lähmung und bleibt für mehrere Tage, während denen er nichts isst, unbeweglich und bei nur halbem Bewusstsein. Sein Körper ist mit dem Blut seines Feindes gefüllt, das er ohne Unterlass ausspeit. Dieser Tod ist nicht nur ein einfacher Verlust der Seele, was im Leben einer Person ja mehrmals vorkommt, sondern er wird wirklich zur Leiche. Er fühlt sich, als ob er verwesen würde.
Yes, so you actually can see this production at several festivals that are part of the Sounds Now network, and the closest festival is festival in Huddersfield, and then it comes to Athens, I believe, and then next year at the Wilde Westen Festival. So I hope not to reveal too much, but just to short comment, this project actually, in my understanding, also shows music as not something innocent or something universal and beautiful and like in a function of decorum, but as actually a strategy that was used to colonize in a very violent settings, and this is very interesting approach to reveal this violent structures and reflect upon it and.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to these issues because I think they go to a very difficult and complex heart of the question of diversity. But let's start with something more sort of immediate and sort of practical in the way we go about our work, right? And I'd like to pick up on something that Maud said in her introduction to her example, which was about the range of practices involved, the kind of things you had to do to actually curate this indeed very inclusive performance, because the participants really did what they wanted, said what they wanted in a frame that was set up as you described. And of course, we think of we tend to think, or we used to think of, let's say, curating as basically, you organize a program, you select what's going to be seen, and you do a program, and that's what curating is. But we're discovering now that, of course, that curating is much more of a much wider, longer process that involves many dimensions that before we might not have even thought about. So I'd like to hear all of your opinions about that expanded field of curating. Sort of how does that work in your own practices today? Maud, would you like to to start?
Yeah, for me it has always been like this. Maybe this is the first thing. I only did curated projects. I worked on it a year, 2 years before the festival or the event took place. Just because the participation and all these projects were central, so it needed to take this time to create a program. And for me, it's really program. I make it together with a lot of other actors, like colleagues, for example, in the first place, but also like the artists themselves. And I like to give a lot of freedom also to the artists and then to also think with them, like how to, like what I said before, like what if or how, and then when ideas are there, how can we even open it up more or create in such a way a listening context that we go over the things we already know. Yeah, I don't know. So it's always a long process. It's in collaboration with, it's like in Belgium we say cross-sectoral. So we cross the sectors
Not only in
of
Belgium,
the
we
arts.
say that elsewhere as well.
Yeah, voilà. So it's collaborations in different fields, from research to social field to social cultural to even sports. I mean, I think, and then what Raquel also said, for me, sound and music are like perfect for that, because it's something that the act of listening is connecting already. So I think in that case, it's the ideal medium to create like this range of programs merging into each other. For me, it's more like this, I think.
Monica, Raquel, would you like to add something to that?
Well, when it comes into this idea of expanded kind of, I think it also is a bit natural for me, because except from this project with the sounds now, the sound art in public spaces, all the curation I've been doing is through projects that I've initiated myself. So somehow I always worked a lot with the intuition. And I think basically I find myself more as an aggregator of people, and this is something that I really like to do, to aggregate. I don't know how what's the best word to say it. And on the other hand, I also think that the work is only, for example, for me also, because I do documentaries and it's part of my other self. So I mix it all together and try always to bring, I think, for example, in the case of documentation, it's another way of being inclusive, of transposing to other audiences what you do, and try to explain a bit, because somehow, again, within the art world, obviously we don't need to explain, or we don't need to be always social oriented or anything like that. But if you can explain, then it's a way of being inclusive also. So the idea of, for example, doing films and try to deconstruct a bit what you do in other formats, I think also it's a way of giving something.
Monica, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, just that from my perspective, curating has a lot of mediating potential. So to think of perhaps existing artworks or pieces of music and taking them and not thinking that they are just existing in some kind of solitary state, but they actually come to a dialogue with each other, and like they interact with one another. So curating is much more making stories and bringing up some additional context that might reach out to the audiences and be this arena of inclusiveness because of that. So it's another layer of translating art and music and sound And that's where I see the potential of curating.
Indeed, indeed. Raquel, I'd like for the next theme to pick up on something, you know, the example you gave from Lisboa Shoa, pronounced terribly, but anyway. So you mentioned a lot about this sort of participatory practices that you sort of developed for many of the works that you showed us in the brief video there. And I'd like to think a little bit about the connection between participation and inclusion, because of course, you know, there's a long history now of several decades of participatory artworks that are designed to break down the barriers between those who create and those who don't create, those who know, those who don't know, etc. But I wonder whether they are of necessity inclusive, because maybe some demographics don't feel they can participate. Maybe there's even another barrier before participation to achieve a sort of inclusive participation. So I'd like to hear a little bit about, you know, from your experience and from Monica and Maud as well, this relationship between, you know, is participation necessarily inclusive, or does it automatically lead to an inclusive, let's say, result or experience?
Not necessarily. Especially, for example, if you work, as I'm working in Lisbon, which is the capital of a country, obviously other cities and places in my country don't have so much access. Obviously, to be really inclusive, I would need to go, I don't know, to somewhere else where there's nothing happening. Maybe if you bring other audiences, I mean, obviously, but I think also it's a way of being inclusive. It's what you can do. It's something you can do. It's in your hands to do it. Now, if you get means to bring people from other geographies, that's a different issue. Because we can all be doing, you know, and try to, and even with sounds now, try to be, to maintain inclusion as part of the, you know, the major concept. Also, I mean, for example, if you think of inclusion in terms of representativity, be it gender or geography or whatever, if you have, for example, an artist from South America or Africa or someone who is in Europe working, because sometimes it's very difficult to bring people from other continents, I'm not sure also if this is inclusion, because are they representative of their own countries also? So it's, you know what I mean? A lot to think of when it comes to inclusion. And for me, it's not only a matter of representativity, it's just a matter of, you know, if you have a group of 30 people participating in something, and if it's one of them will, you know, change something, I think at least a bit of your work is being fulfilled. This answers your question. I'm not sure if I have a complete answer. It
does to agree, but I was wondering whether you felt sometimes, you know, you mentioned like going to another place in Portugal or elsewhere and sort of, you know, to communities that might not have access to Lisbon and where you're doing your main festival. But I was thinking, even, did you ever try or in your practice to work with other communities within Lisbon who might not necessarily of themselves feel wanted, welcome in some participatory project? I mean, did that ever happen as a process?
Well, we had a project with a group of blind people in our first edition. Obviously, we are talking about sound, and it's a bit of kind of obvious group that you want to work with. But it's a project, for me, that project, it's from a Portuguese artist called Rodolfo Quintas. I think it's a good example because he started there doing, I mean, he developed this interactive sound sculpture which would translate into sound the movements of people. So there was, and then he started to work with blind people, and then it came out to be his PhD research and developing a lot of work related to, you know, blindness and how do you, you know, try to add a little bit to this, you know, sense which is obliterated in these people. So somehow he's been, it served for him to grow up a body of work which in itself is his own merit, but in itself is being developed. And this is something that, that I think it's important. In terms of bringing people from other side, there's not, you have to deal with your own conditions of doing, and obviously budget is one of the most limiting one sometimes, and in that regard, not always is possible to do that. But
I'm glad you mentioned blindness, because I sometimes have the feeling these days, that when we talk about diversity, we focus on ethnicity, we focus on gender, we focus on sexuality. But I think at the moment, I have the feeling that we're leaving disability out of the equation a bit too much, and I feel that's an important one to keep in mind. Maud, Monica, would you like to add something? I think, Maud, you have something you wanted to say about all this.
Yeah, maybe. I was wondering, for you, the question was also like, is participation directly inclusion? So, but for me, it's not about the participation itself, but more the quality of the participatory process, which will then maybe result in inclusive context in which people feel at home, or feel welcome, or feel inspired, or. And I think this is something really to mention, that it's not only just participation, but it's really the quality of the process which stands central, and which is also mostly very much linked with the identity of the artist. It's and then how the process is guided also by the organization, etc. So for me, this is important. And then I don't know, I wanted to say something else. I forgot about it.
Well, maybe it'll come back. Monica, would you like to say something about that?
Yes, I think it's very important where this need to include and to have people, varied group participating comes from, because if this is just some kind of fulfilling of like a policy requirement or like industry standard kind of activity, then it's very risky. And so inclusion work requires a lot of care and sensitivity, and like how do we do it? And for example, if we just take some representatives of a certain social group, and that's like a example of tokenism, and we just ask them to act on behalf of their entire community, which is very problematic and risky, and also thinking how inclusion might lead to exclusion, because maybe if you bring certain people from one context to another, maybe back in their own original communities, they might be excluded because now they make a career, or now they are in this big world of mainstream art, and I can imagine situations like that when somebody coming from certain tradition is like exerted into another context, and that might be problematic.
Definitely problematic, and I think we're all aware that the risk of box ticking and tokenism is very, very, very real. And perhaps in a way, on the one hand, it's really good that a lot more organizations and institutions, and not just in the cultural world, but more broadly, are picking up on issues of diversity and inclusion. On the other hand, the more it becomes a sort of standard requirement, as you say, the more there is a risk that, sometimes in goodwill, sometimes not in good faith, that there will be just more and more box-ticking exercises, so that, in the sustainability and the ESG report at the end of the year, you can tick that you've done that. So there's definitely a risk there. So for the last round of questions before we open up to the audience to see if they have anything they'd like to point out or to question, I'd like to come back to what, Monica, you mentioned about the sort of decolonization process, because personally, for me, this is one of the most complicated and difficult issues to come to terms with. Someone, of my age, growing up in Europe, studying, Western European aesthetics, and growing up on modern music, post-war Western music. there's this, of necessity, there's this aesthetic and this understanding, maybe complex, that arises. And then suddenly you realize, as you go deeper or as these things become more discussed, that all this tradition, has roots, comes from somewhere, includes a whole load of dynamics that are much less innocent than you thought when you were sort of immersing yourself in it. On the other hand, you can't sort of step out of your brain and sort of, think completely differently in that way. So how, in practice, how do you think one should approach this very, very complex and crucial issue of trying to unlearn, to de-link and decolonize the way we understand the very aesthetics of what we do? Easy question to...
Yes, very easy. I think it's very complex project. Yes, I think the best is just honest position to acknowledge your situation, where does your intention come from, and denounce your privilege, or situate yourself and like in terms of different class or ethnic background, or this is like a safe position perhaps, and honest. And of course we are going to think about this from different angles. So as a white person, can I talk about this? Or as a having a higher education, can I talk about this? So but I think this brings a kind of self-reflection into the discussion, and that is always a good thing. And so I don't have ready answers for this or ready-made options to choose, but I think just coming from like a honest and reflecting upon our own privileges in this context.
Maud, Raquel, would you like to add anything to this theme?
For me, it's super complex, and it's about what you say, but also about dialogue. I think about honest sharing of ideas and listening. For me, it's about that. It's mostly about listening and being there and being open for anything, like the remarks or just conversations also about these subjects. And being honest also on both sides, I think. Like if you feel uncanny or about some things, just speak about it. Just say it, and then see what it opens up. And And
not always speak from the position of authority, but also like acknowledge that maybe you don't know everything about this, but you are eager to learn and listen to others and give floor to others.
Yeah, definitely. Raquel, would you want to add anything?
I think it's all said. Honesty and listening. It's the two words that I would underline here, because, listening is the most inclusive act that I know, because it is to pay attention. And so when it comes, if you are moved by this, then whatever mistake you make in the process, you will do better next time. I don't know. It's a very complex question. Definitely,
and very difficult to work into, because the easy solution is you step aside, you say, okay, I should step aside, but then you're sort of out of the equation. You're not really dealing with the issue. You're just sort of, in a sense, saying I can't do this, or I can't think through this, and so it is difficult. Anyway, we have about 10 minutes left, so we'd like to ask if there are any questions, comments, polite comments, please, from the audience relating to what we've been discussing. We're happy to take them and try and answer if possible. Nope. Yes. Yes. Two. Great. First of all, I think he was faster than you were, right? So the gentleman in the second row with the, you.
20 or 100 steps ahead of the person that's in front of you. And it's also, you're paid to be ahead as a curator, because you're paid to control something, right? You have to present something in the end. So how do you deal with this? Because what you're looking for, I think, is equal playing field. Is that possible?
So for those who didn't hear, is it possible to imagine an equal playing field in this process of curating? Who would like to take this? Well, I'll start then by saying that no, I don't think there is. There's no equal playing field in anything anyway, and certainly not in curating. For me, I think one way forward is to make the process less personal and more distributed amongst people who aren't like you in the way of aesthetically, in terms of their experiences or whatever. I think there's, for me, perhaps the only way forward, because as you say, at the end of the day, someone looks at the program and says, yes, print it. It's there, if it's a program. So perhaps the only way to really try and circumvent what you're describing is to not make it such a personal and focused and centralized activity, and make a point of bringing others in. I don't know if that's... Yeah.
Yeah.
If I translate it into saying you have to give up control in a controlled way?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, if we're being serious about it, yes. Yeah. I think. If we're being serious about it. Otherwise, it's, we can make a lot of progress before that, but I think so. Okay. The lady in the third row, yeah. So the question is, if I understand correctly, how could this kind of approach, these kinds of approaches and practices make their way into the education system, and how would that change the way music is made in our societies? Is that a fair summary? In control. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, who would like to? Maud, would you like to do that, or who? Raquel, you?
I think it's very different from country to country, and I could only speak from the Portuguese experience, which, in terms of the education system, how do you open up? Well, there's a lot of work to do there, a lot. But to involve people and to involve, the educators, in this case the teachers, because if you go too high in the hierarchy, I don't think it's very effective. But I think it's a way, to bring out projects where you can really make this participation happen in different contexts, either in school context but you need really to have, people from the system with you in this. Otherwise, it's difficult. Anyway.
Yeah, I have not a really long answer. It's a long question and it's super interesting, but it's difficult to watch the future, I think. But I think somehow in Belgium, or in Flanders at least, participation is very high on the agenda, the cultural agenda, and it's really it's a popular word, but it's also by the policymakers really put forward. So I think this is something interesting, and it's a really interesting position for participatory arts to open up even more and become something that is recognized in a structural way in different institutions, but also will find more and more its way in this way towards education, I think. So, yeah.
There's no doubt it's a very crucial area, and as Raquel said, I think it really varies from system to system, but certainly, breaking down the understanding of a very centralized, sort of personalized center of creativity and opening it up, I think is definitely important. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. So Raquel, Monica, Maud, thank you very much. Thank you all for watching, and thanks to those who are online. And have a great afternoon in the festival and the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.